Council of the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice, and we're gathered here today for the Albuquerque International Day of Peace Forum. This International Day of Peace is a day each year for people around the world to stop for a moment and recommit to working for peace, both within and among all nations of people. It is officially observed on September 21st and marked by public events throughout the week. The theme of 2017 is Together for Peace, Respect, Safety, and Dignity for All. I think this theme comes at a very needy time in our world. We live here in a community where we've seen immigrants attacked day in, day out. I'm a Palestinian American. I understand how important it is to recognize nationalistic communities, indigenous communities that are a part of countries that need to be recognized, the suffering that people have taken all over the world. And for us as Americans right now, how do we welcome immigrants? How do we understand that the safety and dignity of immigrants that come in is very much tied to our dignity and liberation and our ideology of what we want to see in our community and our country. The notion of do unto others what you'd like to be done to you. Let's not hurt anybody because it comes back to haunt us in different ways. That's the least of what we can do for our country. If we want to talk about really addressing the core issues of why immigrants migrate to America and how we address the world affairs and what role do we play in those world affairs. Everyday Americans have to recognize that we had a hand in some of the immigrants that come here. The wars overseas, the interference in governments overseas. These people are forced refugees, and we benefit from those wars. So the least we can do is provide a space where they are welcome, where we treat them with dignity and safety and respect. I'm proud of Albuquerque. We stood up and we rose to the occasion and we gave sanctuary to two refugees, setting the tone of the city. So I think the community here is very welcoming of refugees, and we should take pride in that. And we hope that sentiment spreads wide to unite a community. We don't want the divide. So tonight we have an esteemed panel here that are joining us. We have Speaker Dr. Jamal Martin, Director of UNM Peace and Justice Center, Justice Studies. Jessica Goodkind, or Brandon Baca, Refugee Wellbeing Project at UNM.
It's Brandon.
Brandon Baca. Jessica Martin, Supervising Attorney, New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. Welcome. And Daniel Vega, Organizer for New Mexico Faith Coalition for Immigrant Justice. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. Moderating this event is a wonderful mentor of mine. I look up to you every second.
How can you? I'm too short.
But, well, you're a giant in my eyes. And you all, I don't need to introduce, but I'm going to introduce her. Dr. Rosemary Blanchard, Chair, Albuquerque Chapter, United Nations Association, USA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samia, and thank you to the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice for giving us a home for this important day. Okay, now it is, yeah. It wasn't working before.
Okay, you can probably crank it down a few inches.
Okay. Okay, we'll use any mic that works. Is it working still? Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you. Very much thank the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice for giving us a place to be here. And this is one of these ones you're supposed to swallow and play funny with before it'll actually amplify your sound. I'm not used to that, but what the heck. Anyway, we are doing. This is a really difficult time. I will acknowledge that I have not, as one of my braver friends did, actually watched the whole Trump address to the United Nations. I was preparing for this day, and I thought if I sit and watch that, my stomach's going to start to get upset again, and I'm going to get all edgy again, and I'm going to have a certain amount of time I have to spend bringing myself down from having watched it. So I swear I am going to watch it because I feel as a citizen I need to know what my president says, especially when I can't stand it, so that I can respond to it not just saying, oh, isn't that bad, but knowledgeably. And I force myself to actually know what people say sometimes. But I haven't been able to do it yet because this is the International Day of Peace. It's a day that's sponsored by the United Nations. The United Nations was rather thoroughly dissed yesterday by our president in a way that is not humiliating to the United Nations, but it is humiliating to us. And it does tell us why we are here today for the International Day of Peace and why the theme today is so important. Together for peace, respect, safety, and dignity for all. Because we seem to be losing globally and nationally that sense of safety that comes when everybody is respected. You don't have to agree with everybody if everybody is respected, because there's certain limits on where those disagreements will go. In the absence of respect, disagreement becomes dangerous and scary, and people find themselves assaulted in their dignity or in their body or both. And so it's a very important time for people in our community to gather and to look at some of the situations, some of the trigger places in our community and in our larger national society where respect, safety, and dignity do not seem to be universally available for all or seem to be threatened. And our panelists, Dr. Jamal Martin, Jessica Martin, Brandon Baca, and Daniel Vega, who have each been introduced in regard to their organization, are each going to take a few minutes now to tell us, one, who they are, and two, to give us a little idea of how the work they're doing intersects with the needs and obligations of our community to create a place that is safe and respectful and upholding of the dignity for all. Now, before we do that, we are going to go silent for a minute, because a tradition of the International Day of Peace is for every place in the world to take a moment of silence. It becomes like a silence wave in support of peace, respect, safety, and dignity. So I would ask you to become silent for a moment and hold our fragile world, nation, and community in your hearts. Thank you. I wish I had one of those cute little mindfulness bells that I could invite to sing so that we would end in that fashion, but I didn't think of it. So, our first panelist, Dr. Jamal Martin is the director of the Peace and Global Justice Studies program at the University of New Mexico. And I've asked him to give us some of his insights on there's a very local crime called disturbing the peace. What's disturbing the peace among us at this current time? And what are some of the strategies that he and his students and our colleagues in the academic and social active communities are engaging in or can engage in to restore the peace? In 5 minutes or less, Dr. Jamal.
I was just thinking if I had a clear answer to that question, I would probably win a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, you would, unless they caught you doing it.
Can everyone? Okay, this is better. All right. Well, one of the things that we're trying to do with our program at the University of New Mexico is that we're trying to train students to become strategic peace-building educators and to be involved as scholar activists in this work. For me, as a public health scientist, I recognize that violence is a public health issue. So within that realm, I bring my experience in terms of epidemiology, the study and distribution of diseases and populations, to understand violence, because violence is a public health issue. And in doing that, one of the things that we know that if we're going to have well-being and human security and health and human security in the world, we first have to establish peace. And that's a prime requirement, even with the WHO, the World Health Organization, in terms of understanding that before we can talk about housing and food sources and other types of things, we have to establish peace. So in order to do that, we do this work again, there's a difference between what we do in terms of peacekeeping. We're talking about peace building. So the students undergo a process of learning various skills in terms of coalition building, conflict transformation, issues that deal with justice and healing, and issues that deals with systems change and human development. And so we work across boundaries and disciplines to look in between the gaps, because I often tell the students, you can't solve these complex problems with one discipline alone. You have to be well-versed in liberal arts and humanities and other types of things to look at the gaps, to see where there are opportunities to rethink and become very critical and very creative in our thinking and understand their alternatives with this work. One of the things that we have to help people understand is that the old world is dying and the new world is trying to be born. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. With all these issues that are raising up now regarding hate crimes and other things, it's like the last march of these people when you really sort of look at it. It is dying and they're fearful. And so, out of this angst that's going to come forth will be a new birth and a resurgence. Because one of the essence of what we do with our program in peace studies and global justice is that we're trying to build hope. And so one of the main things I think that as we deal with this, one of the problems that I see, one of the most difficult problems, is trying to get people to look upstream where the policies are created in the first place rather than downstream. It's important to have rescue fantasies and try to do things one at a time, but we have to do something to change the actual system itself. Because we have an education system, for example, one of the main things that I target as well, is that it's been designed to maintain this power and privilege, under this notion of supremacist ideology. And so we have to change the whole educational system so that it is less accountable to neoliberalism and market economies, because that's not peaceful. There's a lot to be said here, and I know that I probably have maybe about 2 minutes left or a minute left, and I speak very fast sometimes also too, but this is my main objective right now, is to help students become strategic peace-building educators. Some of you may remember the name Dag Hammarskjöld. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And he had a statement that I think is still very important that we understand today as we talk about this issue, because when I first got involved in my work in public health, I had an opportunity to work with the United Nations, with WHO and UNICEF, and working in Southeast Asia and around the world on projects with UNICEF and things. And I understood the fact that you can't have a healthy economy unless you have healthy people. And so I became more interested in human rights issues in education on a level, which is why I love working with Rosemary and others, because we're going to bring about some opportunities to incorporate human rights education in grades K through 12 by trying to help schools become human rights friendly schools. So there are a lot of different things we're working on, but Dag Hammarskjöld said, the purpose of the United Nations is not to get us into heaven, but to prevent us from getting to hell. And I think that's an important thing to remember, as we go through this. And the idea also, too, is the fact that getting people to understand our common humanity and the fact that dignity and justice is for everyone and not those that can afford it. So there has to be a revolution of consciousness that takes place. And so I try to bring all my different experiences and careers, backgrounds into this in terms of my interest in primary prevention of psychopathology, my interest in epidemiology, my interest in human rights education, and public health law research, changing the laws, bringing new policies and things that exist. I'm also a member of the CERD committee, which is the Covenant for Eliminating Racial Discrimination, and I'm also a member of the United Nations group that deals with the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Intolerance, and Xenophobia. So there are a number of different norms and things that we can bring into this process. And believe it or not, one of the things I learned from working globally and internationally was that there's so much that we do in a global setting that can work here locally. And we need to start doing that. But in doing that, we need to re-educate people to this process because we have a history of a nation that really, after the Civil War, reverted, you know, with the broken promise and failures of Reconstruction. And therefore, we see this new notion of the South shall rise again, and the new South and the lost cause. And what frightens me now is the fact that so much of this has been incorporated into our everyday educational process at the universities and schools. This notion of where it's about patriarchy and hate and intolerance. And it's being practiced and it's being educated, it's being taught in schools. So our blowback to this is actually come back with a counter narrative, which is human rights education. But these are people, when you look at, well, let me back up for just a moment, back to my high school years, and I think I've run out of time, and I'm being told to shut up. Can I say one thing very quickly? Yes, you can say one thing. Go back and start to reevaluate Jeffersonian democracy, Jacksonian democracy, and Wilsonian democracy. And you realize that when you look at Wilsonian democracy, this is where all the racial stuff became codified in government. You know, and I can talk about that later in another section, so thank you.
There is so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Martin. And I must say I have a great enthusiasm for the idea of bringing the idea of human rights friendliness into the culture of schools so that the environment in which our youngest children are educated is one that reinforces the idea that respecting others builds the respect that I have too. There's nothing to lose in respecting your neighbor in that you build the respect for yourself because that becomes how we all treat each other. So I'm hopeful that more will come of this. I hope somebody's recorded this. I am going to so hold the University of New Mexico to human rights friendly schools. Okay, but now in a less human rights friendly environment, unfortunately, has been the deterioration of the way in which our country is treating our immigrant population. We know the very serious threats that our undocumented immigrant population faces. Now we find that many times our documented immigrant population, if they have not crossed this T or dotted this I, can find all their security upended too. So it reminds me of one of those, of the description, frankly, of the progressive loss of rights in Nazi Germany when people felt like it's them they're going after, and suddenly the part of the them was it's me they're going after. And so I'm going to ask Brandon Baca to talk a little bit about what you are, the program that you have both with Pajola and at the university in terms of helping refugees get integrated into our society, and what it is, what works, where you need greater support from our community.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for having me here today. So the Refugee Wellbeing Project is it's actually a 2-semester course that we teach at the university. So we take undergraduate students in sociology, psychology, many different fields. We train them. The first 3 months they go through training. They learn who refugees are and a bit about their experiences. They learn about adult education, teaching English as a second language, about advocacy, about many different things. After we train those students, we match them up with refugee families that just arrived here. The refugee families come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. We primarily work with those populations because a lot of those populations are really unfamiliar with U.S. customs, U.S. systems, and the English language. And so after we train the students, we begin what we call learning circles in November. And from November through May, we engage students and refugees in these learning circles. So all of the refugee families come, all of the students come, and we have about 3 hours together. We have cultural exchange time where we spend time talking about our cultures. So it's not only just about Americans teaching refugees about American culture. And I think this is really an important point, that oftentimes refugees and immigrants come here with a lot of experience and a lot of skills that they can contribute. But those things are not really valued in American culture, or there's not a platform for them to talk about their experiences and to talk about their strengths. And so this is a way that we can not only share what American culture is like, but also have refugees from these cultures share their cultures and their systems with Americans, which I think is very key in terms of building peace and building understanding, because everybody comes with stereotypes and everybody comes with presumptions, whether it's Americans thinking about, Congolese are this way or Syrians are this way, but they also come with some of those too. Not all Americans are rich, and not all Americans are like what you see on Friends. And the second half of the learning circles that we hold, and these are weekly sessions that we hold, the second part is we have one-on-one time. So our students work one-on-one with the refugee families that they're matched up with on whatever that family wants to work on, to pursue their goals, and to help in breaking down any barriers that they're facing in terms of accessing local resources. So this can be, for adults, this is oftentimes a place where they can get help making a resume, practicing doing a job interview. For kids, it's homework help often. And our students, they're both matched with adults and kids. Outside of that time, our students spend 3 to 5 hours every week advocating with the families. So they spend time helping them access and navigate local resources. So this can be setting up a doctor's appointment, handling issues at school and communicating with schools between the parents. Oftentimes, APS teachers don't know that they can request interpretation. So they're sending letters home to people who speak Swahili in English. And and they're missing these opportunities, whether it be field trips or even other things having to do with truancy. And so in this program, one of the real focuses of the program is that we want to bring the community together in bridging refugees and Americans. And so we do that through the cultural sharing and through really working together to solve these problems together on an equal playing field, instead of a dynamic where there's a helper and a helpee. But we really want to break that down and understand that these are normal people who have strengths, and we really need to honor those strengths and to build on those strengths and really build leadership in the refugee community as well. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brandon. And I must say, a place where I think what Dr. Martin and I are talking about and what you're doing is creating the environments for the children of refugee families in our public schools. Because I know, I have relatives who teach school, and I have friends who teach school, that many times a school doesn't really know that a child's special need is that they are a refugee, and that they are still dealing with why they became a refugee. And they don't really know what to do about them. And I know of one elementary school incident where I won't mention the elementary school or the grades or anything, but let's say a little boy who had acted out in some ways in the past and whose English wasn't very good, got tricked by some other little boys into pulling the school-wide fire alarm. And if you want to get in a whole lot of trouble, even in elementary school, you pull the school-wide fire alarm. And he was about to be disciplined for it when one little girl of a different classroom but the same age got upset in her elementary class and said, "But that isn't fair. He didn't know what he was doing." And so her teacher was able to tell the principal, and the whole thing come around. Now, I see that as both an opportunity to learn to be welcoming on the part of kids, but also showing how important it is that we have the schools and the children in those schools involved in the act of welcome. And that's why this theme for this year's Day of Peace is such an important one. How do we make that little boy, and even the little boys who put him up to it, feel respected, safe, and upheld in their dignity? Okay, with that, let's take a look at the real black mark in our country, which is the way we are legally treating immigrants who are undocumented and immigrants whose documentation can be upended because they sneezed wrong sometime. So I'm going to ask Jessica Martin to tell us a little about the work of the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center, and in particular, some of the ways we civilians can help in the purpose of that center by the way we interact with and support our immigrant communities.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So I am a lawyer. I work at a nonprofit organization, the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. We provide free legal services in immigration cases, and as a lawyer, I have the great privilege in my day-to-day experience and in my daily life of working with immigrants as my colleagues, as my clients, as my co-conspirators, etc. So I love the work that I do. It's a little bit different, and being here, I haven't been in an academic setting in a while, and everything's so big picture. And the work that I do is really on the ground, day to day, based on what the need is on this day. That doesn't mean that our agency is short-sighted and we're not thinking about the bigger picture, but what I can share with you today is much more about those day-to-day experiences and what's actually going on with immigrant families here in New Mexico. So I guess what I'll say is that, you know, we are all listening to the news. We're all aware of the latest policies and things that have been proposed. How it's affecting families in New Mexico is that it is having a very big impact on the sense of security for immigrant families. Even those who have applications pending, when the president was first elected, called and said, "Should I just leave the country?" There was this immediate sense of hopelessness and fear that overrode even the fact that they had an application pending and they were just awaiting a decision to gain legal status. And others who are permanent residents, who have their green card, who've lived here for decades, who come into the office and say, "Should I just leave?" So I think there is a great amount of fear that's been created, not only for those who are undocumented, but also for those who have been permanent residents for many years. It's motivated many permanent residents to apply for citizenship, and that's been a really beautiful piece of this. I think more and more people are feeling empowered and want to take more action, and they've found that engaging in becoming a citizen to be that vehicle to find more empowerment. I think that in terms of the need in our community, In New Mexico, it's huge in terms of legal services that are available. There are very few organizations that provide immigration legal services for free or for low cost. And as a large rural state, we may be able to provide services in Albuquerque or Santa Fe, but there are, of course, the rural counties which are not getting many services at all. So these are ongoing barriers for families in New Mexico. I have 2 minutes left, and I want to just talk for a minute about what we consider the removal machine. Removal is the legal word for deportation. I had the chance this weekend to be in the Bay Area, and I visited Angel Island, which had one of the first immigration detention centers on the West Coast in the early 20th century. Hundreds of Chinese immigrants were detained for months and even years in some cases on Angel Island. And I visited that museum this weekend, and I was so struck by how small the building was, because several times a month I have to go out to the Cibola County Correctional Center that holds 1,100 people and has hundreds of immigrants rotating in and out there on our nation's removal machine. The visit, while it was upsetting to me in a historical sense to Angel Island, and knowing that that was part of our history, was even more disturbing to me to think about how evolved and complex that removal machine is now. I think there's an incredible need in our community for more people to get active in activities to end detention of immigrants, especially asylees who are presenting at the border to seek safety against persecution and are instead detained for months and years. Many don't understand why they're detained. They feel that they're being treated as criminals and have no sense of why, after all that they've suffered and all that they've survived to get to this place, how it is that our nation could treat them as criminals with so little respect and really stripping people of their dignity. I think that Daniel's going to talk more about the New Mexico Faith Coalition's efforts with regard to different immigrant advocacy efforts. So I will leave that for you to talk about. Our agency really focuses on providing legal services and then also providing training in the community. We work with a lot of collaborating partners. We have a holistic model of services, so we make sure we are embedded with other agencies and organizations who are working with immigrants, so that our services aren't performed in isolation. Yeah, I think that's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I hope folks will leave us some contact information for yourselves, and we will share with you appropriate contact information with our panelists and the organizations they represent, because some of you may wish to carry these dialogues further. I think they represent first steps of some work that we've all got to do. Okay, the legal situation, and then there's the human situation of our immigrants. I was shocked when I saw a posting, not really shocked because I had heard that the Haitians were being locked up in Cibola County. But in Albuquerque, you don't expect to get an email that says, we have some asylum seekers that are being released. Does anybody speak French? But that was the call that went out. So why would, which I think speaks to the isolation that ICE is imposing on these asylum seekers and other detainees. Why would they pick the least likely place for anyone to be a French speaker and put somebody there and say, okay, now protect your rights? So I'm going to ask Daniel to talk about the New Mexico Faith Coalition's work and what you need from the rest of us. As someone who's a member of Albuquerque meeting of the Religious Society of Friends, I know one thing you need from the rest of us. More churches that can find a way to offer sanctuary. within the confines of your church environment, your church estate, because we are in desperate need of homes for people who are at risk of losing everything. So, with that little pitch for what you do and what more needs to be done, Daniel, tell us what more needs to be done.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Vega. Well, I think I should start saying that I'm an immigrant myself. I am a DACA recipient. I came to this country when I was 9 years old because my parents wanted a better life for me and for them. I work with the New Mexico Faith Coalition. I started since March. I started working in this because if everything that I saw in before the election, all the hateful rhetoric towards immigrants, I just couldn't sit down and not do anything. So I really started getting back. I had done some activism in my high school, but I really started getting back on November 9th. That's when I started getting into activism again, one day after the election. What we do in the New Mexico Faith Coalition is that we draw from the beliefs of so many different faith communities that human dignity is a right, it's a universal right. And we believe in family unity, and we believe in rich diversity, and this is everything that the coalition does falls under these values. And we don't only work with faith communities, but we work with anybody that wants to uphold these values as well. And one of our biggest projects that we're working with, as Jessica was mentioning, was that we're trying to find housing for the people that are being let go from these detention centers, these asylum seekers. And we're trying to find places where they can stay, and we're trying to help them get back to their families. That's one of the biggest projects that we're working with. It's a big undertaking. That's something that we do need from the community. We need for faith communities to open the very buildings that they give for families that give shelter to families, or to those that are homeless, to open those same spaces for the people that are coming out of the civil detention center, and for them to have somewhere where they can stay until they can get either get going here in their lives, or try to find out what to do. As Jessica had mentioned, so many of these and Rosemary, so many of these people are so removed. It takes them some time to get back to where they need to go and what they need to do. Another big project that the coalition is working with, we are the leading organization that's trying to push sanctuary here in Albuquerque and New Mexico. We have 2 cases of sanctuary, one by the Friends Meeting House and the other by the First Congregational Church, in which they have both taken a person that was facing deportation. One of them is a 56-year-old grandmother that's a cancer survivor. Every one of her family is a U.S. citizen, but she's a priority for deportation. The other case is an Iraqi man, a 65-year-old Iraqi man who is not a veteran, but served the U.S. military, served the U.S. government, and faced torture because of it, and who is deemed a deportation priority to the United States. And so we are trying to push other congregations, as Rosemary said, and facilitate conversations for faith communities to open up the spaces that for so many people that need it, and also to facilitate conversations in our communities to bridge the gap that we have in our communities, in our immigrant communities, and our communities here for the communities, the American communities, to understand what immigrants are going through. And part of that's what we're trying to do. It's for communities and congregations to really understand the struggle of the immigrant. And another one of the projects that we're working with is we're trying to support a an effort by families helping families, immigrant families helping immigrant families, and they're there for moral support. They're there for financial support as well. They support each other financially. What's mine is yours mentality. They're there to help each other fill out power of attorneys. Immigrant families that have the risk of facing deportation have to have power of attorney forms filled out for all their children, for someone to take care of their children in case they were to be deported. And this can happen any day, and so they have to be ready for that. And so we have these families supporting families, and one of the things that we do to bridge the gap in our communities and understanding is for the immigrant families that we work with, we get together with our volunteers, our American volunteers here, who are citizens, and we bring them and we share food, and we share the same space, and we have conversation with each other for mutual understanding, because as Brandon was saying, we have stereotypes from both sides. And so it's for our immigrants communities to see that for unity in our communities, because our immigrant communities, whenever they see the Trump rallies that were happening in the elections, they picture someone that's white, someone that's going to tell them to get out of the country, and that's who they picture as being racist. When that's not the case. All white people are not racist. Not all people are racist, and so is that understanding that of that racism, for the understanding of racism, and of our cultures, of our mutual cultures, and for our direct service to understand what more the life of the immigrant. And that's some of the bigger projects that we're working with. The Faith Coalition works through volunteers. We have close to 500 volunteers, and every one of those is working with us because they have a deep sense of justice and humanity and compassion. And I'm really grateful to work with every one of them, and that's one of our biggest strengths in the coalition.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I would say that, folks, even if you do not have to be a member of a faith community that is offering sanctuary to be able to become one of those who accompanies from time to time, stays in the same space as the people who are in sanctuary. And there are trainings that you can take in order to accompany. And what I found, I've only accompanied twice, but I've taken 2 trainings, that it's something, even if you think, well, I don't know that I could do it, it helps to know how you would speak to ICE if ICE was yelling at you, to calm yourself. We have fears inside us that we sort of, when we push them down, we don't know what they are. But to learn as we do through these trainings. And here's what they can't do, even when they're knocking at your door. Here's what you could do. I have found it calming to me and to many other people just to know what ICE is. They're not the boogeyman anymore. They're ICE. So I encourage you to get to know more about what the Faith Coalition is doing, whether your church is offering sanctuary and whether you can actually take a turn as an accompanier. And with that, I had some focused questions, and the only one that doesn't seem to have them on a piece of paper is me. Somebody,
Rosemary, there's a training tomorrow.
oh, is there?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, let me announce it right here then. Just for being in the town where it all might happen, these trainings are valuable, believe me. Okay, Friday, September 22nd from 6:30 to 8 p.m. with the option to stay and ask questions afterwards. Can't beat that. At the First Unitarian Church, 3701 Carlisle Northeast at Comanche. So it is and you can register by sending your name and cell phone number to Marion Bach. I'll write up, I will put it up on paper somewhere. It- Okay, it's on the bulletin board in the lobby. mbox7185@hotmail.com. So, but don't try to remember that. It's on the bulletin board in the hallway. Okay, so this will be sanctuary accompaniment training, and I hope that some of you can be there. Now, what I'm going to do while I'm asking some questions of our panelists, well, I was getting ready to be an informed moderator. I went online and I found a group I've never heard of before called the Community Initiatives for Visiting Immigrants in Confinement. They're called CIVIC is the acronym for that. And I don't know much about them, but what I'm going to pass around is the 2 maps I was able to download. One, all the places of immigration detention in the country, quite a batch, and then those in and near New Mexico, because I made the map bigger. So I think just to get a sense of what we're dealing with. And remember, this immigrant detention is also refugee detention. People seeking asylum. This is the whole schmazzola, as we used to say. So let me pass these 2 maps around from Civic Community Initiatives for Visiting Immigrants in Confinement. And maybe when this is all over, we'll find a little more about who they are and whether we could do something like that. Cibola really bothers me. I lived in Gallup for a number of years, and we used to always say that the only thing good about Gallup was at least it wasn't Milan or Grants. Now that's unfair, but the fact is, to have a immigrant confinement center out there, there's not a whole lot of local community that is going to make friendly with these folks. We're probably about the nearest community that will. And that whenever I get too comfortable, that begins to fester in the back of my mind.
There's another event coming up that's Immigrant Solidarity event for people in detention. Do you want to announce it?
If I knew it, I would.
Well, I can give you the information.
Okay, this is Tina Cashel. She is the clerk of Albuquerque Friends Meeting.
It's going to be at the meeting house on October.
She's my clerk.
Do you want me to announce it?
Yeah, just announce it real quick.
So I only know a little bit about this because I just helped set up the space. The Detained Migrant Solidarity Committee, and Daniel or Mariela may be able to say more. The Detained Migrant Solidarity Committee is hosting a workshop on October 7th. That's Saturday from 12 to 5. It'll be at the Friends Meeting House. And I'll just read this quick thing. Facilitating a discussion on how to support detainees at Cibola Detention Center. In this discussion, we hope to center the voices of those currently detained and recently released. We invite you to listen, participate, and imagine meaningful solidarity with those targeted by the for-profit prison industry, the violence of the imperial borders, and white supremacist colonization. So again, that's a workshop. It's open to the public. It's from 12 to 5 on October 7th. Thanks.
Thank you. Glad to know about that. I am really glad to know that somebody is beginning to notice that Cibola County has become a detention site, not even for people who are gathered from New Mexico, but from people who have no idea where the heck they are. Okay, so, panel. And I think we'll start with Dr. Martin here, but I want to hear from all of you, Dr. Martin, Daniel, and everybody in between. What's happening to us? I have a sense of our becoming less safe overall. I feel less safe, and certainly our communities of difference feel a lot less safe. How has this escalating neo-nationalist rhetoric intersected with our government's actions to create a sense of fear and insecurity in our communities? What are our communities are turning into fearful places? What's driving it, and how do we stand up?
It's a complex question. I think in some ways the fear for many communities has always been there. It's never disappeared. When you look at the history of this country, it's always been in the background. So it's nothing really new in that sense. But as you look at this rise of extremism that we've been talking about, a resurgence of it, I think that what you're going to see is probably more recruitment and increased memberships in certain organizations who feel disgruntled or not a part of the American dream as they once supposed in terms of their power and their position. I think that if you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, they show the increase of hate groups in the country over the last few years or so. And right now, as of this year, there's 917 hate groups across the United States. And 40 exist in Pennsylvania, 79 in California, 63 in Florida, 55 in Texas, 47 in New York. And with that, you also see a 197% increase against, in terms of anti-Muslim hate groups, and 130 total active KKK groups. So it's been a resurgence of this in many ways. It's always been in the background, but I think as we live in this information and this technological age where people have more access to media reports and other types of communications, it's become heightened in that sense. And so it's just, some of this may just be a better artifact of better reporting in many ways because it's always been there. But for people who have newly arrived to this country, they've often believed that America's streets were paved with gold and everything was, crisp and clean. But that's not the case. So there's a reawakening there in a sense like maybe somebody lied to me, something is wrong here in that sense. And that ties in with the notion that I've always said that our biggest enemies are always fear, doubt, ignorance, and superstition. And the only way to overcome fear, doubt, ignorance, and superstition is to establish truth, justice, mercy, and compassion. And that means we have to go through the process of really evaluating our education system again as we look at that. Martin Luther King, during his Nobel Peace Prize speech, said that the axis of evil in the world today, stemming from America as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, was racism, materialism, and militarism. And I think we've seen increases in that also, too, in that regard. And so and we see it at the local and state levels as well. So it's an interesting phenomenon. And I always say that if you're going to do this work, you can't do it from a historical perspective. We always have to go back in the past and look at what has preceded us to see if we can learn from it. And in many ways, we have not in some ways. So again, to reiterate my statement from earlier, that old mindset is dying out. It's on its last legs. And we just have to weather this storm and keep moving forward with truth, justice, mercy, and compassion, and trying to eradicate it at its roots. Because I think many of us have been trained to sort of look at the iceberg effect. We just look at the surface and not realizing there's so much more under the surface that we need to deal with. And if you just handle that effect, you're not dealing with the causes. And as a prevention person, I like to deal with root causes. I like to get right to the cause of it and say, hey, let's get rid of this once and for all. And that means a larger opportunity to talk about social transformation. But it's difficult within our educational system right now because of the corporate mentality that's taking over educational systems and incorporating these bouts of knowledge from not only from neo-Nazis, but the Neo-Confederacy, which is another strange, interesting group that's taken place, and they've turned it into a religious war also, too. So there's a lot to be discussed here, and I'm happy to kind of go through some of these things with people on an ad hoc basis. But the bottom line is we have to keep our hope, and we have to keep our faith, and we have to keep moving forward with our allies and support one another during these challenging times, because this is not over yet, and it won't be over for a while. In fact, I tell the students, for many of us who've come through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and 80s, things were relatively quiet in some ways, but not really. We have to pass that baton on to the next generation. And this millennial generation, their legacy may be the ones that bring this to a head in that sense, because they have had the opportunity to receive a lot more information than any other population at any other time in history. But they need help, I think, in terms of from the elders in the community about how to guide them through this process and how to make it work, and developing it so that it becomes wisdom and not just knowledge and just not a fact. And so we got work to do. We have a lot of work to do, folks. A lot of work to do.
We certainly do. And now I'm thinking that one of the things that we need to do, is to stand up not against kids who act out in ways that seem hateful, but to use it as an occasion to say to the system, hey, this is something you got to deal with. I'm thinking of those boys who photoshopped those little KKK hoods into the picture, except for the 2 black students. And I heard an unconfirmed rumor from a school I won't mention of a group of boys who sat in the corner of the cafeteria yelling, Heil Hitler, kill all the Jews. and their school did respond. I mean, but the point is, they responded probably disciplinarily toward those boys. As these things keep happening, it's an opportunity to say to the school, disciplining the kid who did that is missing the point of what's going on here. These things didn't used to happen, and we still had a lot of naughty kids. So let's look at the environment in which naughtiness is manifesting itself in these kinds of ways. So don't be too silent when you hear one of these things in the school. Don't think, oh, it was just kids. I get so tired of hearing it was just kids. Now, let me hear from between Brandon and Daniel, which of you wants to?
Okay, so I wrote down a few notes. So there are many ways Trump and the current administration has enacted policies or actions to instigate fear in our communities, and I deliberately chose the word instigate. The words of Vice Director stating that if you are in this country undocumented, you're a criminal and you should be watching your back. That's an accurate reflection of the spirit and the attitude of our government towards immigrant families. Before and after the election, numerous reports of hate crime surfaced across the country. Across the United States, there's an uptick in hate crime. The neo-nationalistic fear-mongering rhetoric has virtually given a welcome to hate in this country, although this has been, hate and discrimination has been part of this country for a long time. Individuals have taken to themselves to put America first, as this president says, and feel not just free but supported by Trump and the administration to tell a Muslim or an immigrant to get out of their country, which too often leads to violence from the former, because there's no respect. There's fear in our immigrant, LGBTQ, and other communities that when in public, someone is going to confront them and attack them for the way they look and the way they speak. And I feel this fear myself, even here in Albuquerque. When they look up to the country, they look for safety. The only thing they see is a xenophobic Muslim travel ban, a president that calls immigrants rapists and criminals, a president that takes away the given rights of patriotic citizens to serve our country in its many needs because and only because of their gender identity. It's important to highlight that the government is using fear in two ways. Fear is not only present in the communities that are criminalized through words and enacted by policies, but fear-mongering is another part of our reality. There are people who truly believe that immigrants are criminals and are here to terrorize and take away everything from Americans. And in saying those words, I remember my brothers and sisters, the Native Americans. But it's also the fear. It's not just the fear from the immigrant community, from the affected communities. It's this government, Trump and the administration, planting and nourishing the. I don't know if nourishing is the right word, but fueling the fear of that there's foreigners here invading this country, and this country is going to be taken away from your hands, and you need to do something about it. There's fear from both sides, and we need to realize that, and this is why bridging the communities and getting to know each other is so important.
Thank you.
So I'd like to just add on. I think Jamal and Daniel both said it so nicely. And one thing that I just want to speak about, because it's my personal experience, because I have the opportunity to interact with a lot of different people from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and from some of these places. And actually, one of our first learning circle this last year was on Election Day. And it was a pretty surreal moment for me I really did not expect the outcome, as many of us felt the same way. And I literally just got done having a cultural sharing session with a bunch of families from Afghanistan, and I looked at my phone and I saw what happened. And I just looked out and thought, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to these people? I'm really worried right now. Nobody was worried. Nobody really knew what happened yet. So anyways, I want to say that after the election, there was a lot of fear. And not only fear because of what Trump has been saying, but because nationalism is not something that's unique to this nation, of course, and it's something that's sweeping the entire world right now. We're seeing it in France, we're seeing it in England, in Germany, in Myanmar. And so I think it's important to recognize that, of course, while holding on to hope, because there's a lot to do, and I definitely second that. We have a lot of work to do. And also, in thinking about what neo-nationalist really means is the first thing that I thought about when I heard this question. And I don't know if it's any different than white nationalism. It seems that our neo-nationalism right now is white nationalism. And I think that is really important to recognize that that it's not only immigrants, but this is a long-held structure of racism and oppression in America that we have to address, as Jamal said, upstream of really breaking down these structures from before they really get started. The last thing that I wanted to say is that in speaking with families throughout the election, every week we had updates on what was going on, and there was a lot of fear. A lot of people from the Middle East, a lot of Muslim women were worried that is he going to take away the hijab? Is he going to make it illegal for us to practice our religion? And it's really heartbreaking to see that. But at the same time, I found more hope in talking with them than I found in myself. I found myself thinking, losing some hope. But talking with refugees, they've been through so much, and they've been through hell, and they've experienced racism that is so extreme, whether it be in their own country or even the countries that they fled to. Many of the refugees from Afghanistan fled to Iran, where they don't have the right to work. On a daily basis, when they leave the house, they are called out for being Hazara or for being Afghan, and they're spit on and treated like inhuman in the street. And so I think that's important to recognize that this is a global struggle that we're going through, but there's a lot that we can do, and that we need to hold on to hope, because even those who are most affected by this, they're hopeful. They see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I think that's important to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ease you into the next question, Jessica.
Sounds good.
Because the next question, which I want to hear from everyone who has something that they want to contribute on it, is, okay, we know what our current immigration policy is, more or less. But do we know all of the, I won't even say unintended consequences, do we know all of the collateral damage that our communities are experiencing because of this immigration policy? Our communities, our schools, our neighborhoods, police-community relations, our own sense of ethics and our ability to live our ethics in our community environment. So, how is this policy manifest in the quality of life here?
Yeah. So I think it's important to recognize while we're very clear that we feel that we're in a different political time, for many immigrants, the fear has always been here, as Dr. Martin said. For many peoples who have experienced oppression, they've experienced fear for generations. And so in some ways, I think that some of the same things are happening. Situations where people who give birth here in the United States in a home birth or in a situation where they're not in a hospital may be afraid to register the birth. So you actually have a U.S. citizen who birth is not being registered due to fear. There are so many different aspects of it in terms of our schools. parents who are afraid to engage with the teachers at schools, in school meetings, to become more involved. I don't know, in some ways I feel like, Daniel, the work that you've been doing, you may be more able to speak to what families are engaging in, what the fears are on a daily basis. But I think that in some ways, not much has changed. There are certainly new fears, I think, especially for those who are permanent residents. I think there's a lot of increased fear with the latest announcement regarding DACA. Many of the young people who have DACA are very fearful. Many have come to be a source of support for extended family. And so it's not just the fear for the self and what am I going to do, but what is my family going to do? Because I have come to take on supporting my family, etc. So is there another aspect of the question, Rosemary, that you'd like me to answer?
I think only, the question kind of, I guess, was as it was, particularly your experience of the police and community issues that
right.
arise around people's immigrant status. And again, not only those who are undocumented, but those who are documented also have to fear that some encounter with the law will upend their documentation. So talk about a safe community when people are afraid to deal with the police.
Right, and so that is also something that's ongoing. And in my particular work, I haven't necessarily seen an increase in this. This is how it's been for more than a decade. That undocumented immigrants, there are some who are very fearful of calling the police if they've been the victim of a crime, or to report something, or to participate in investigations as witnesses, because of fear that the police will be collaborating with ICE and that their immigration status may come to light and that they could be turned over to ICE and deported. Women and children who are fearful after having been victims of domestic violence of coming forward and accessing services, unsure if service agencies are safe places. So there's a lot of just community trust in general, not just in terms of police support, but in accessing services in the community. Albuquerque has a pretty good network of services that are very focused on immigrant issues and on being relevant to what the needs are of the immigrant community, between Enlace Comunitario for domestic violence services or Centro Savila for mental health support. And then organizations providing know your rights information, such as El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos, that does a lot of work around wage theft and employment issues. So there are a lot of really amazing groups and organizations in Albuquerque that are working with the community to increase trust and build partnerships. But in some ways, I haven't seen that the fear in New Mexico anyway has amplified that much, because there was already a great deal of existing fear prior to November of 2016. So, and I don't know, Daniel, if you have a different perspective on that.
So from one of the persons that gives Know Your Rights workshops at El Centro, and so we have we hear some of the concerns in the community. That's actually how we start the Know Your Rights workshops, and from the workshops that I have personally given, I have seen an increase in fear, and that fear has always been there. It's always been there, And I've experienced it myself. If there's a cop car driving right behind you, there's an entire physical reaction that you have in your body when you have that, because you think that, like, as soon as there's any sort of minimal interaction, I'm gonna be put into a removal process. That's the thinking that an immigrant has in police community relations. And here in Albuquerque, APD has a legal binding resolution that they are not supposed to ask for documentation for a person that's stopped, and for any other reason. But it's really important for the community to know this, and we had a forum with APD, and we let them know that if the community doesn't know of this resolution, it might as well not be there, because the fear is still there in the community. The community doesn't know that this resolution is there, and so and this is where education and the new rights workshop comes in. But yeah, I've seen some families with a lot of fear, and one of the projects that we're working with, and it's sort of in response to this, and also to the fact that ICE has been present in the courts, ready to stop people that are going to even pay a traffic ticket. And so there has only been a handful of confirmed cases, but even just one is too many to have in our courts. And that's why the coalition has a program of court companionship, where there are people who are trained to legally observe and accompany our clients, the community, to remind them of their rights and to be there in case anything were to happen. We are not able to actually stop a detention or an arrest, but we are there to provide the family with the information and the network of support in the community, because when someone is detained, they can get lost in the system for weeks, and that is a nightmare for the family that's going through it without knowing where that person is. It's as if that person just went missing out of thin air. That's what happens too often when someone gets detained. And I've personally heard of cases from some of the cases that we're working with, that even people who need to go to hearings because they're the victims of sex crimes, they do not want to go because they think they're going to get arrested and they're going to be deported. And so that's the effect that is having on our communities. And I'd like to speak a little bit to the social and ethical issues as well, of how it's affecting us. Since the new administration, there has not been a single speech or action that expresses the value and necessity of immigration, a fundamental and natural need. But in every one of its policies, it criminalizes immigrants, and new immigration policies serve not to uphold the law, but rather penalize those who have migrated to a place where they felt they could be safe and find a better life. And so, as Jessica was saying, we have so many asylum seekers, political asylum seekers in the Cibolo Detention Center, that all they did was come to the United States, walk up to an immigration official and ask for help, and they take him immediately into detention. And that's all they did. And we are punishing, this government is punishing people who is asking for help, and they are there for months and years. And so I spoke with someone who was recently released from the Cibolo Detention Center, and he came from Guinea, Africa, and he's going through a political asylum case. And in the course of an immigrant, while it's making his journey, that person's making his journey to the United States, that person can find himself in jail for many reasons. And so he said that he found himself in jails in different countries, and he said that the worst one was here in the United States, more than other countries, in second world countries, third world countries. The detention center here was worse than in other countries. something that was completely just appalling to me and that I never heard, but this is something that he said and that other people in detention has shared with him as well, that the immigration does not let the detainees send letters to the United Nations to complain about the subhumane conditions that they live in, the medical assistance that they're not getting, that is substandard, the food that can sometimes be rotten, and that is not nutritional at all, and also we can hear, and this is something that the United States, or at least its immigration department, seems to be proud of. Joe Arpaio, who just received a pardon, was quoted saying that the jail that he was running, he called it a concentration camp. That's what he called it, and also we can see, yeah, it's really bad conditions. In the detention center. Other things that we can see from how it's affecting our schools is the law that was just passed in Texas, the SB 40 law, which requires all law enforcement to ask for documentation in Texas, and that includes security at schools. They are forced to ask students for documentation, and if not, the department and will be fined $20,000 a day. And so this is the thing that is emboldened by the immigration policies that have taken place in this new administration, and this president and the administration seem to call on law and order so much, but their actions speak another truth. The administration seems to have no regard for due process, and when it comes to immigration, and I think they're really stepping on the Constitution when it comes to immigration.
Okay, what we're going to do now is go into two other. We're going to hear from. I'm sorry, we're going to hear from Brandon too. Were you?
Oh no.
Okay, I'm watching. Listening to them getting totally.
Dr. Martin would like to say something about it. Actually, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
I've been listening to the fantastic and wonderful informative comments by my colleagues, and I thought of 4 points that I would like to add to this notion about current immigration policy and how it affects us all. One, obviously, it's a stain on the human soul, and we need to talk about the morality of all this to people in that sense. But with that, I think it's important to remember that immigration and citizenship, has been a problem in this country since 1790. And it's an ongoing problem, which suggests that it's embedded in the culture and the history of our system all throughout. And so while it's good to always intervene whenever necessary, but we have to change the system. We have to transform the system, because people have always been struggling for diversity and dignity in that regard. The second point I wanted to make is that with that, we have to remember that there's an increased synergy between this xenophobia and intolerance. And that synergy leads to anti-democratic ideals. We have to make sure that people understand that. And then third, all this work, because we're not looking upstream to change policies as they exist, and some of the institutionalized racism that exists. And Brandon mentioned this before. We haven't really named the villain in the room, which is white supremacy in all its forms. It continues to add to the dehumanization of people. And I've often told people that whenever you want to go to war against somebody, you have to dehumanize them. And once you dehumanize them, you can take away their dignity, and then it's easier to offend and kill and create violence against them. And it subtracts from, this notion of having a social cohesive nation. And last but not least, I guess, just in summation again, this work, it contributes to the phenomenon of violent radicalization. And it foments it, increases it. And as a result of that, people who are not creating the structural violence in the first place suffer from all the chronic stressors that wind up having an impact on their human health and their body. And this is why we see so much drug addiction, suicide, genocide, cancer, immune dysfunction. Chronic stress does that to people, folks. It's not their biology that's defective. It's having to live in a socially toxic environment. And I always tell our medical students, we can't treat people with pills and medicines and put them back into a socially toxic environment. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. So we have to cut it out at its roots. So I just wanted to kind of say that part. Thank you.